How can we promote fair agricultural transitions in Africa? On the occasion of the 2024 Paris Peace Forum Spring Meeting, organized in Morocco on June 10th, in partnership with the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, we invite you to discover a series of podcasts focusing on the shared North-South objective of fair transitions. Over the next 30 years, the agricultural landscape in Africa will face profound challenges intertwined with issues of food security and sustainability. With a rapidly growing population projected to double by 2050, the continent's agricultural sector must undergo transformative changes to meet escalating food demands while safeguarding natural resources and ecosystems. What are the key goals of promoting fair agricultural transitions in Africa, especially in the context of addressing food security and sustainability challenges? What are the primary obstacles or barriers that need to be overcome to promote fair agricultural transitions in Africa? In what ways can local communities, governments, and international organizations collaborate to accelerate progress towards fair agricultural transitions and improve nutrition outcomes in Africa? To address these questions, we've invited Patrick Dupoux, Managing Director and Senior Partner, Head of Social Impact Practice, member of Boston Consulting Group's Executive Committee.
So we believe that the dollar that is invested in the African agriculture is probably the best dollar that can be invested in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, for many reasons. If you look at it from a pure economic development point of view, Africa will need to invest in its food systems, agricultural and food systems. That's the biggest sector in terms of employment, in terms of economic activity, in terms of value creation potential. If you look at it from a point of view of food security, obviously we know that food insecurity is quite concentrated in Africa, so it's absolute priority. And now if you look at it from climate perspective, the countries which will be most impacted by climate change in the world are mostly in Africa. And the real impact of climate change will be reduced agricultural yields in a number of areas which will become more desertic with droughts and less rain and more heat. And these areas are actually the ones that may generate climate refugees, which is probably the biggest impact globally of climate change. So the best investment in climate adaptation in the world is probably to invest in African food systems to make them more resilient to climate change. And last, even from a mitigation and emission point of view, Africa could actually represent a real carbon sink, both by avoiding deforestation, which tends to come from lack of arable land and deforestation, but also because the African soils can sequestrate carbons. So from whatever angle you look at it, we believe that the best dollar that can be put in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals today are in Africa for sure, I think everyone agrees, but are in the African agriculture systems and the African food systems. So this is critical to achieve most of the SDGs, and this is why we believe that this initiative is very important to achieving the SDGs.
What are the primary obstacles or barriers that need to be overcome to promote fair agricultural transitions in Africa?
The first barrier and the first obstacle is just the lack of investment. 20 years ago, a number of frameworks were developed, like CADEP or the Malabo Agreement, that pointed to the fact that there was a lack of investments in the agricultural food systems and systems in Africa. And a target was set. Actually, only 4 of the 54 countries in Africa have achieved this target, which is about 10% of public investments in the agricultural sector. We are very far from that. And in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lack of investment overall in the agricultural value chains in Africa. Both public investment, as I said, but also DFIs. The development finance institutions only spend 3% of their total amounts of ODA, development aid, into the agriculture sector, while it's by far the biggest priority for Africa. So I think the first obstacle is to remind everyone that we should massively impact investments in the agricultural value chains in Africa. So it's the first conditions. And then once you agree that we need more investments, you need to make sure these investments are going to be well spent and efficiently spent. And here we need to agree on what does sustainable agriculture means in Africa. And there are very different views. the views from the global north, which obviously comes with its own reality and tends to over-index climate impact and mitigation. But in a way, it's sometimes inadapted and slightly selfish, because in Africa, the top priority is obviously to reduce the impact on the environment, but it mostly to adapt to the new climate reality, so to adapt to climate change, but also to ensure food security and to create jobs and wealth in Africa. So how do you find the right definition? How do you combine all these objectives? How do you get a joint framework between private sector, public sector, global north, global south, government, development finance institutions is critical. So it's about how do you define sustainable agriculture, and it's also how do you achieve more productivity, more resilience of the African food systems. And this requires, we believe, an approach by value chain. And you need to make sure that every investors do agree that the way to work, because everyone has his own theory of change around the African agriculture, but it's very important to align on the key principles. You don't need to align on all the details, but the key principle of interventions and investments to be most effective. And we believe, for example, that one of the key areas is to have an end-to-end value chain approach, because in agriculture or in food systems, if you invest a lot in, for example, fertilizers, but you don't have storage, then you generate waste. If you invest in storage, but you don't invest in fertilizer, crops, irrigation, well, I mean, you have storage, but you have nothing to store. You don't generate surplus. If you don't have market access at the end, well, you just generate surplus that actually crush the local prices and actually create problems for the farmers because they produce more, but they don't have a market. So it's this subtle end-to-end balance that is required, and it's another way to generate some consensus among all investors to make sure that the investments in the agricultural value chains are efficient.
In what ways can local communities, governments, and international organizations collaborate to accelerate progress towards fair agricultural transitions and improve nutrition outcomes in Africa?
Food systems and agricultural value chains in Africa, like elsewhere, involves a lot of stakeholders. Obviously, the farmers, which are at the center of it, local communities around them, local governments, national governments, private sector, so the inputs player, fertilizer, crops, pesticide, irrigation, storage, off-takers, so the food companies that buy those products, and then the international organizations that are part of the funding equation. And then you also have a lot of service providers that provide what we call extension services, so financing services, training, capabilities, IT enablers, and so on. All this ecosystem, which is quite fragmented, in an industry that by definition is fragmented, you know, it's not like steel where you have like 5 big plants in Africa. Food is dozens, hundreds of millions of farmers scattered around a very large continent. So the industry is fragmented, and the players are also fragmented. So you need to generate a minimum set of consensus agreement on how to do and how to invest in Africa. So the first way is to make sure that everyone agrees on how priority it is to invest in the agricultural value chains. So you need to raise the awareness and get agreement that this is the top priority investment, both for governments, for the farmers, for Africans, for the world, for everyone. And that's not a small thing, because as I said, it's 30 years of underinvestment, and it tends to be sometimes more sexy to invest in IT, in industrialization, in other sectors, infrastructure. But we actually think that agriculture is the number 1, 2, and 3, maybe with education. Education is another priority, but in Africa. So you need to agree on really elevate at the right priority level. And then you need to make sure that all the players share the same approach, as I said, where basically each one is contributing to what he does best. So the donors, philanthropies, or international organizations can provide guarantees. They can provide also some elements of grants that actually lower the cost of capital for private investors. Private investors are critical because they are the ones who are going to invest both in the primary production, but also in the offtake and all the value chain, the transport, the logistics. NGOs or local service providers can help provide the trainings, can help provide the extension services. The banks are critical. They need funding. They need the loans that are adapted to the farmers' reality and to the sector. So you need to make sure that all this broad set of stakeholders cooperate effectively. We believe that the right, I would say, brick or element is, as we said, the value chain in a given country. So, for example, I don't know, rice in Côte d'Ivoire, because then you need to bring all the interested stakeholders on this rice value chain in Côte d'Ivoire to act together. So they are each playing the right role, but they need to agree on how to do it. Because if everyone disagrees and has his own way of looking at things, then it's not super efficient. And even the governments and international organizations are critical, because the regulation is very important, both locally. How do you secure investments for the private sector? How do you organize the market? But also internationally. How do you make sure that, for example, the EU or other countries do not set trade barriers that actually precluding investments in Africa? So everyone has to play his role in a relatively organized manner, but in a very fragmented and local industry. And that's how we can achieve major progress in the sector. So as I said, I truly believe that there are two priorities for the sector in Africa. The first one, make sure everyone understands the need to raise investment, increase investments, and to allocate more of their investments into the sector. And second priority is to make sure everyone agrees around the priorities and how to achieve more productive, more climate resilient, more environmental conscious and smart agriculture in Africa. And if you look at the set of stakeholders who are acting in Africa, they are all focusing on one part of the equation. We believe that, and there are lots of players, lots of, international organizations, governments, private sector and so on. So we believe there is a value to actually have everyone sitting at the same table and agree on a minimum set of principles, both on the principle of more investments and on the key principles to make more efficient investments. And this is the role of the Atlas Lab, which will be launched during the spring meetings of the Paris Peace Forum, which we believe will fill a very important role. Not to try to do the investments by themselves, because there are lots of institutions who do that, but just like create the forum and the tables to drive these conversations, this consensus, very difficult to achieve, but at least simple to express, which is increasing investment and building consensus on how to drive efficient investments in the agricultural value chains in Africa. So this is what Lab Atlas will be doing through advocacy, through measurement, through a bit of research, and also by putting the spotlight on some of the actions, initiative, organization, projects that actually contribute to make the African agriculture, I wouldn't say great again, but great.
Thanks so much for listening, and please don't forget to check out the spring meeting sessions on the 10th June online on our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and sign up to our email newsletter.